everyone to Zoom into Books this afternoon. We have an esteemed guest and author with us today, Nasir Shansab, with guest interviewer Burke Allen. So Burke, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for a very special edition of Zoom into Books and also our Big Time Talker podcast, brought to you by our friends at Headline Books and SpeakerMatch.com, the world's largest online virtual speakers bureau. If you've been paying attention to the media in the last week, you certainly have seen the news, seen the images of what's happening in Afghanistan. The world has changed quite a bit. And I've asked my old friend Nasir Shansab to join me here in the Allen Media Strategies studios here in suburban Washington, D.C., to bring some insight to what's happening there. Nasir is an American citizen who's been here since 1980, but was born in Afghanistan. And he's the author of the book Silent Trees, which we'll talk about in depth. But first, Nasir, I want to read something that you wrote in September 2013 for the Diplomatic Courier, which I thought was really interesting. Again, September 2013, Nasir writes, "As long as its present leaders rule Afghanistan, nothing will change. And the products of chaos, they've thrived by it. They abhor the rule of law, would do anything to thwart it. Under these conditions, elections will be meaningless. The country will gradually, but inevitably, slide into mayhem." And boy, that's exactly where we are right now.
Yes, indeed.
So first of all, I'm very sorry about what's happening in the country that you were born in. And this is a big question, but how did we get here?
We made quite a bit of mistakes. We should have not actually gone to Afghanistan, and 9/11 perhaps made it inevitable for the United States to go into Afghanistan. But we should have just left it as soon as we thought we did what we wanted to do. And we didn't do that. But we also installed in power people who really didn't care for the rule of law, who didn't care for rebuilding the country. The United States has paid more in today's dollars that the United States spent in the Marshall Plan after World War II to rebuild Japan and Germany. But when you go to Afghanistan, and I was just there a few months ago, you don't see what has happened in Afghanistan, because nothing has happened, almost nothing. And most of this was stolen. And we have what Afghanistan didn't have, it has now, which is a good number of billionaires and a large number of millionaires. But the people live in poverty and insecurity, and it's a traumatic thing to go there and see it.
If you're just joining us and you're scrolling through on Facebook Live, Nasir Shansab is our guest today on Zoom into Books and on our special edition of the Big Time Talker podcast. He's an American citizen. You've been in the country for over 40 years, but still maintain a home in Kabul. And as you said, you were just there a few months ago. As you saw this unfold on television, what were your initial thoughts?
It's a nightmare, but I was not surprised because just about early in March, I wrote a piece, and I really said that I don't want to say that
I told you so, but you said I told you so. You did.
But I did say that something like that would happen if we did not plan the exit properly. I don't mind that the United States leaving because we really didn't do anything there and spend a lot of money and a lot of blood, and that's fine. But I always thought that when we did go leave that country, we should have planned it properly and give it a little more time. After 20 years, even if we got it a year to plan for it and do the exit properly, I think would have been better. But what happened has happened, and we can't change it now.
If you have questions about Afghanistan or about Nasir's book, Silent Trees, you can always post them in the chat room, and we'll be happy to answer those as we go along. If you happen to be watching the Facebook Live presentation, you mentioned this this article that you wrote in March of this year, and as I recall, President Biden in April threw the gauntlet down and said, you know, we're going to be out of there by September 11th. A month before that,
yeah,
this is what you wrote. This is from an article that Nasir had placed in March of this year. This is not a country to be abandoned. This is a country in urgent need of an honest and functioning government. This is a country in urgent need of the rule of law and strong institutions. Needs to be supported for a few years with foreign funding and controlled economic planning and investments. That is the challenge. It's something America has done before and can do now, not only for the sake of the Afghan people, but also for the sake of America's reputation and credibility. So indeed, you did. I told you so, and I get it. And you and I have talked about this for many years, that there's an enormous amount of corruption within the government there. You've also talked about literacy, the lack of literacy throughout most of the country being a real problem. What's the number one issue that has caused so many countries to think they can come in and right the ship there, and it never happens?
Well, one thing they should have done is study Afghanistan's history. Afghanistan has been invaded many times, and the people or the countries that invaded Afghanistan left humiliated. It's a harsh country. It has a very harsh climate. It's very mountainous, and a normal, heavily armored military unit cannot fight the Afghans because they know their mountains, they know how to climb, they know how to walk. They don't eat as well as we do, and they don't eat as much sugar as we do. So they are slim and can walk for hours. If we send an American soldier with 60 pounds on top of his back and heavy boots, it's very difficult to hunt those people. But this has happened before, and it happened now in our time, and that's fine. But what I think we should have done is not stay as long as we did, number one. Number two, if we did stay as long as we wanted to, and if we did really want to help Afghanistan, we should have chosen people of integrity, people who would have not stolen money, who would have really worked for the country and the people. And I think the people deserved that and needed it. And we didn't do it, and the people took advantage of it. And ultimately, this is what happened.
I want to take our viewers and our listeners back into your childhood. You grew up there, and you're a very modest guy, but I did my research. Your family was somewhat akin to the Kennedy family here in the United States. You were raised by a wealthy businessman father who then sent you away to boarding school in Germany. And after that, you went back to Afghanistan as a young man. Tell me about that time in your life.
When I went back, I was quite young, 24 years old when I went back. I didn't know much of Afghanistan and didn't have any friends, but I did get to know 2-3 people. And I said we have to do for the politics of Afghanistan because it was a dictatorship. And I remember we were so afraid of being watched or heard that we went outside Kabul for about 100 kilometers or 80 kilometers and went into a garden and sat behind a tree, under a tree, and talked. And 2 days later, I was walking through a bazaar in Kabul, and the secret police got me, took me to their headquarters, and they said, "Look, you're the son of a good man. if you do this again, we will break your teeth.
Wow.
So it was very efficient. I didn't know it was so efficient.
So do you think that the fact that so few Afghanis have that global perspective that you gained as a young man, you left the country, you went somewhere else to school, you got an education, does the lack of that global perspective and that education really cause a lot of the generational issues there?
Well, I'm certain that the lack of good education and in terms of Afghanistan, the lack of real education is a terrible tragedy for the country and for the people. In the countryside, there's almost no education, and 80% of the Afghan people are today, in the year 2021, are illiterate. The army, where we thought the army would fight well, 11% of the soldiers in the army are literate. The rest are all illiterate. And that's a tragedy. We had from the 1930s till about the 1970s, we had a peaceful, internal peaceful country. And we could have trained and educated at least 2 generations of Afghans. But the psychology was, and the policy was, that a educated population would get rid of the government. And the government was actually at that time a family government. They felt that they owned the country, they owned the people, and they didn't want the people to know, to think. The best was to keep them as dumb as possible. And they did do it, and they did succeed in it.
You left Afghanistan and moved with your family here to the United States in 1980.
Yes.
There was a time in the 1980s that you consulted the Reagan White House as the Soviets battled Afghanistan. I think enough time has passed now. Statute of limitations is up. Can you tell us the nature of what you did with the White House?
I did basically what I'm trying to do today. At that time, my suggestion was not to interfere with the resistance, to help the resistance. And when the Taliban came, and I knew that the resistance was very split, and I found out, I knew most of the leaders, and I think it was in February 1982 or just before 82 probably, there was a conference about Afghanistan in Geneva, and the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, agreed to leave Afghanistan. And I immediately went to Peshawar and talked to all the leaders, got them all together, and told them, you are going to win, you are going to take the country, but you have a lot of problems among themselves, and you have to solve the problems, talk about them, solve them, and then go to Afghanistan. And one of the leaders whom I knew very well and I trusted, he turned to me and said, this is a lie, what the enemies of the resistance speak of. We are all friends, we have no problems. And the problem was, they went into Afghanistan with all the problems between them, and started a civil war, a very savage, very bloody civil war, a destructive civil war. And that is actually why the Taliban came about.
Nasir Shansab is our guest today on Zoom into Books and the Big Time Talker podcast. If you have a question or a comment for Nasir, you'd like to talk about Afghanistan or his book, Silent Trees, and you're watching on Facebook Live now, send us a message in the chat room. We'll be happy to field that question. And you can pick up Silent Trees at headlinebooks.com, amazon.com, or wherever books are sold. Nasir, if I recall this correctly, there was a time when you very briefly met one of the most infamous criminals in the world. And because of that criminal being in Afghanistan, that was a big reason for the Americans to occupy that country in the first place. Tell me about the time that you as a young man met Osama bin Laden.
Yes, I met Osama bin Laden. Somebody had spoken about me to him. He was in Peshawar, Pakistan, and he was an ally of the United States at that time because he was helping the Afghan resistance against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan.
And people forget that he at one time, Osama bin Laden was an ally of the United States.
Absolutely. And he invited me to breakfast at the Intercontinental Hotel in Peshawar. And we sat together and had breakfast. And I must tell you, I didn't like him. I didn't know what he would be ultimately, but even then, he was a very tall man. I felt very small when I stood beside him. One of the first things he did, he ordered fresh oranges, and I did the same. And the waiter came back and brought the fresh orange juice, and he sipped from it and said, "This is not orange, and this is not fresh." And he cursed him very badly. And those people are poor; they are not paid well, so I stopped them. I said, "No, this is fresh orange juice. Maybe not made right now, but maybe made an hour ago." And he didn't like that, and I didn't like him, and he didn't like me. But we did, and I also saw that he was treating Afghans very badly. Afghans who claimed, rightly or wrongly, to be fighting for the resistance inside Afghanistan and needed money. While we were having a breakfast, they would come, sit at the table, tell them their story, and he would throw packages of $100 bills to them and let him go. There was no control. There was no questions. It was a very corrupt and stupid way of doing it, in my mind at least. And I never saw him again, and I never talked to him again. And the next time I heard his name was when he was a big enemy of the United States.
Wow. Nasir Shansab, our guest today on Zoom into Books and the Big Time Talker podcast. We're talking about his birth country of Afghanistan, and the book is Silent Trees. You got a copy of it here. Nasir also wrote a book sometime back called Soviet Expansion in the Third World. It's a case study of Afghanistan. This is Silent Trees. This is a fiction novel, but as I read this book, an awful lot of what you wrote about in this book, boy, it sure is taking from real life. The corruption, for example, you talk about in the police there. You've experienced that firsthand.
Well, Afghanistan was a dictatorship from the beginning. It was a very isolated third world country. Nobody knew much about Afghanistan. As you know, most Afghans didn't know much about the outside world. Most Afghans at that time felt that Afghanistan was the center of the world, and all the rest of the world wants just to grab it. And they were very proud of being totally isolated and not having to do with anybody else. So it was not very different from today's Afghanistan, because nothing much has really changed. The countryside is still illiterate mostly, and still very, very poor. The cities are chaotic a little bit, very corrupt. The police is corrupt. Everybody is corrupt. It has not really evolved, and it lives in a different era. I believe that most Afghans live in terms of the way they look at the world, of the way they look at themselves, of the way they look at religion, maybe in the darkest Middle Ages. And I think that's a real big problem. The gap between today's lifestyle, today's values, and the gap that is in Afghanistan, to bridge that. It's too large to bridge it easily. But I had requested Washington at that time when the Taliban came into being and took Afghanistan. I said, let us not show them, frighten them from us. Let us give them the ability to think that we are not trying to get rid of them. And I said, let us go there and help them economically and change them slowly and gradually. Of course, the warmongers wanted to get rid of them immediately. And some Afghans like Mr. Karzai, who became the president of Afghanistan, said, give me 200 men and I will kick them out of Afghanistan. and that was, of course, a big lie. And a lot of Americans believed that. And that was a tragedy that we actually did not, from the beginning, try to be a partner to them. And maybe we would have avoided 9/11. It's a possibility. If we had a good relationship with them, maybe they would have not hosted somebody like Bin Laden.
There's some people that I'm sure who have seen all this unfold with Afghanistan's very rapid fall, who would say, look, there were 18,000 interpreters and their families, and they should be given safe passage to America or other countries. Whereas other folks would say, you're just inviting more potential terrorists into the country. There's no way we should do that. You've got a unique perspective on that because you have been an American citizen for over 40 years now. You've also maintained a home in Kabul and you've gone back on occasion. Where do you fall on what should happen with these Afghanistan citizens who helped Americans?
Number one, I really think that the Afghans have never done anything that we would call international terrorism. There is no background in Afghanistan of that. Number two, these people have worked as interpreters or chauffeurs or drivers or something like that for now 2 decades for the American forces, for the American personnel, for American companies. And they are really afraid, rightly or wrongly, I can't judge it really, but they are afraid that they will be killed when the Taliban actually then settle down and take over the country. I believe that we have, as Americans, and America has as a country, a responsibility to get them out. They are not terrorists. They are simple people. They are not wealthy. They are not terribly educated. They have families, they have children, and they are terribly afraid. I believe that we have a responsibility to bring them in.
You also said earlier you don't believe that America should be there forever. And I think most people would agree with that. When and how should that drawdown have happened? Because clearly what happened was in no one's best interest. It didn't work out well. So how should it have been executed properly?
I think when the United States went into Afghanistan after 9/11, we should have gone with a big military force and then decided for the country what to do with it. We did not do that. If we had plans for staying a long time. But we went there with a very light military force. We went there with people from the CIA with big sacks full of $100 bills, and we actually bought the worst of the worst in that society, the warlords and the drug kingpins, to fight America as well. And the beginning was a bad beginning, and it continued, and we didn't change. It took about 10 years, maybe in 2009, 2010, we decided to stay longer, and we decided to enlarge the American presence there, the military presence, and also to make investments in the rebuilding of the country. But it was a little bit too late because the Taliban in Pakistan had resurrected themselves, rebuilt themselves, and had a force, and had already entered Afghanistan, the countryside, and it didn't work out. It was maybe too late. We wanted to do it. That we should have done right in the beginning, but we didn't do it. And when we did it, I think it was too late.
So is President Biden to blame for not listening to his intelligence that said this was going to happen? Or as some others have said, is there plenty of blame to go around through a whole lot of different folks?
I think that the
latter?
The latter is correct.
Yeah.
It's not one man who's responsible or two people. I think it's the administration as a whole mishandled the policy around Afghanistan. As a matter of fact, President Biden, a few years ago in a meeting in the White House, somebody told him, I think General Petraeus said in the meeting that the government of Afghanistan was a criminal enterprise. And it was then Vice President Biden who said, but if the government is a criminal enterprise, what does it mean if we send more troops there? And the question was, shall we send more troops or not? And nobody answered. That question remained unanswered. So I think he was for quite a number of years not happy with Afghanistan or with the US, what the US did in Afghanistan. So I think that his a little bit sudden decision to get out, it was he probably had that inclination.
Was not so sudden after all.
I don't think it was so sudden after all. Yes.
Our guest is
But I don't know.
I
don't know.
You can't be in his head, understood.
No, not in his head, yes.
Nasir Shansab is our guest today, and we're talking about Afghanistan and Nasir's book, Silent Trees, a book about power and passion in war-torn Afghanistan. It's available now from Headline Books, also at Amazon.com, and it's on Headline Books publisher page imprint. And it's a very interesting, almost a thriller, a police thriller, if you will, set in the 1970s in Afghanistan. And I really love this book. I learned from the book, but it's an old-fashioned page turner. You actually, several years ago, and you were very modest about it. You didn't bring it up other than I said, oh, where have you been on your most recent trip? And you said, well, I just got back from England. And I said, well, what were you doing there? And you said, well, I addressed Parliament. And I said, what? So you find yourself in some pretty interesting rooms based on what? Your background in Afghanistan? People are just puzzled by this enigma of a country, and you bring insight?
Well, I grew up in a school in Europe where there were students from all over Europe. Okay. French students, British students, and Germans, of course, Austrians. So I got to know a lot of people. I grew up with them. We lived together, we ate together, and that, of course, was very helpful. And it's very fun. I just received an email. They want me to come to London to talk to one of the large think tanks, and also to talk. It's not the Parliament really. It is the Parliament House. I have not gone to the Parliament itself to talk to them, but in the Parliament House they usually invite and guests come. And I have been there, I don't know, 4 or 5 times during the last 10 years or so. So yeah, I mean, it's just, we know each other. The point is that we as humans have to get to know each other. Once we do that, then a lot of the problems we see in other people, in other cultures, will evaporate, will not be there. That's what helped me.
I like that attitude. We've talked about policy. I want to put a human face on what we're seeing, and I think the image of those hundreds, thousands of folks in Afghanistan on the runway chasing after those C-130s will be, seared into my mind forever. How much desperation do the people there must feel because of the Taliban being in the country to run after airplanes and try to hang on Tom Cruise Mission Impossible style to get out of the country?
Well, the first time when the Taliban took over the country in 1996 till 2001, it was something. It was a government that behaved like perhaps the governments did in the year 1200.
Wow.
And this was very harsh. But they really interfered in the private lives of the people, and that was very hard for the people. And the Taliban then, I think felt that they can live totally isolated from the outside world, and they had no economy. So there was a lot of poverty, a lot of harsh treatment of people, total isolation of women. And it's very hard for me to understand, because we didn't go through that, to understand how much fear these people felt for what they actually did. I mean, it was absolutely chaotic. It was terrible to watch it. Maybe that's the fear, and of course, people who work with the foreign community in the last 20 years, they were afraid. And I'm also sure that people who were very corrupt and became very rich, some of them were probably very frightened. But I very much hope that the Taliban in the last 20 years have changed. I don't think they have changed too much. But
so you don't buy into this kinder, gentler Taliban that they're presenting themselves?
Well, I think I would wait for the dust to settle, and then make a judgment. I heard the spokesperson speak yesterday, and in front of the media, and I must tell you, he was very convincing. It was a good speech. I mean, if they have changed to that extent, I think they might be a good solution for the Afghan problem.
And just the fact that they are speaking to the media and uncovered, that's a thing.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
You've maintained a home there all these years, and you still go back. You were in Afghanistan just a few months ago.
Yes.
Thank God you weren't there this past weekend.
Well,
paint a picture for Americans, Westerners who are watching or listening right now, of what life is like in that city. Compare it to a major metropolitan area here in the United States, say Washington, D.C., or Philadelphia, Charlotte, North Carolina.
Yeah. It's the traffic is very chaotic. You have a city of 6 million people and probably 1 million cars, and you have no traffic lights.
Wow.
just
wow.
Just to manage that is impossible. So it's absolutely chaotic. It's you can probably walk faster than you can drive, but nobody walks because it's not safe. People came and grabbed you and took your phone from you, and if you didn't give it to them, they would kill you. Security was terrible. After dark, nobody went out of the houses, and everybody has high walls around the house, have built high walls around the house, and you have steel doors, very strong steel doors, and people lived in fear.
Now, you were fortunate that you didn't live in poverty, as you said so many people do in Afghanistan, but what about normal creature comforts that you have here in the United States? Was the electricity, for example, was that readily available and consistent? Did you have clean drinking water? Those kinds of things that we take for granted here.
None of the above.
Yeah.
The water is dirty. You can't drink it. Electricity. There's no running water in most of Kabul. There's no sewage system in most of Kabul. The electricity comes and goes, and maybe if you count together all the electricity you had, maybe you had 4 hours of electricity in 24 hours. It's a life that I think the average American cannot even visualize, and cannot, and it's a very, very difficult life, at least for people like us who are blessed of having everything ready. The way they survive, I sometimes wonder how they survive. I got to know a family, husband, wife, 3 kids, 1 daughter, 2 sons. The husband is retired and probably gets very little money. One of the kids goes to high school, and one of the kids the daughter goes to high school, and one of the second son goes to high school. The older son goes to university, and the only person working is the mother and the wife. She gets 7,000 Afghanis a month. 7,000 Afghanis several months ago when I was there was about $90. We believe that if a person has less than $2 a day is poor, very poor. Now, can you imagine $90 a month for 5 people? I mean, we can't. I cannot understand how they survive.
And it's my understanding that Kabul, as bad as you make it sound, is by far the most advanced city in that country.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So that's the high water mark.
That's the high water mark. Yes.
Nasir Shansab, our guest today on Zoom Into Books. We're talking about Afghanistan and the turn of events there, and also Nasir's book Silent Trees, which he wrote. It's a fiction novel. I want to talk to you about the inspiration for this book. Power, passion, and war-torn Afghanistan. This is a made-up story, but there's some.
It's fiction.
There's some. Although it's a page-turner and it's fiction, there's. You paint a picture that sounds very much like what it was like there when you were a young man.
I think that writers who write fiction, I personally don't think we can write fiction in a void. It's what we see, what we feel, what we experience, and that what we write then is part of that. You can't really. I mean, as somebody who writes about the space, maybe you can invent everything. But if you write about life here, it's part of your life. Yes, it's part of what you have experienced. Maybe in another way, it's maybe a dramatization of what you feel and what you have seen. But it's part of you ultimately. Yes.
And the reviews were just incredible. Kirkus Reviews calls Nasir's book Silent Trees a fine evocation of a crucial era in Afghanistan. U.S. Review of Books, a glimpse into Afghanistan just prior to Russian or American occupation. Shansab gives his readers an idea of the overwhelming complexity and corruption that can occur. The Diplomatic Courier says Silent Trees is an enthralling political and personal fiction. If you're interested in political books, political fiction, it's a very different kind of read because it's politics, behind the scenes look at an Afghanistan that is no more. However, it is much as it has always been for thousands of years now. Now that the Taliban is in rule, Will you go back to Afghanistan?
I have decided to go back, and I hope.
What's wrong with you? Why are you going back?
I didn't grow up in Afghanistan, but I was born there, and I do have an enormous affection for the average Afghan.
Okay.
They are very simple people. They are very hospitable. They are not what the leadership is. They are the opposite what the leadership is. They are honest. They are sincere. They have a very harsh life. And I can't separate myself from that. And there's a thread that binds me to them. And I have told myself many, many times, you don't have anything to do with that anymore. Your children are here. I have grandchildren who were born here. I have a house here that I love. I can't cut it.
When you see the footage of what's happening at Karzai International Airport, you want to be in the middle of all that? What do your kids tell you?
Well, my kids think that I'm totally out of my mind.
I think side with your kids on that until things calm down over there a little bit.
Yes, and my nephew Steve from the army, he wrote to me, "This is a none thing you should do."
and listen, you call him Steve, but you may want to share with our viewers who Steve is.
Steve is my nephew.
Yeah.
He is the only son of my oldest brother, who is not alive because many years ago he committed suicide, and he's the product of the love affair of an Afghan student and a German girl.
Steve has done pretty well for himself career-wise. What does Steve do for a living now?
Steve is a 4-star general in the American U.S. Army, and he commands Africa from Germany because the command center is not in Africa, it's in Germany, outside Stuttgart.
So you got thousands of people trying to get out of that country, and you're going to be the only guy going in that direction.
Well, Steve wrote to me, "Don't do it." So
I side with Steve. I'm with Steve on this.
But I will wait till the dust is settled and see what comes out of there.
So you're not a futurist. You're a smart guy, and you knew that country very well. And at the beginning of the show, we read this quote that you made in 2013, where you pretty much called this exactly as it played out. So I'm going to ask you to put your futurist hat on now. What happens next in Afghanistan, specifically as it relates to the United States? For example, are we going to have to go back in there to make sure that that it doesn't again become a haven for terrorists?
I very much hope that the United States does not quit Afghanistan completely. I think we have to be present. We have to have, no matter what happens. The United States, whether we like it or not, is militarily, politically, economically, and I think even culturally, a global power. It cannot afford, whether we like it or not, we cannot afford to be absent totally. Especially in places like that, especially in the Middle East, especially in South Asia, we have to be present because that is the only way we can change things. If you're not there, we have no power to change anything. So we have to influence those people, and we have to be there. And I pray to God that we will do that.
Earlier today, Nasir and I are in Washington, D.C., the suburbs of Washington. I talked to a former intelligence officer who did 3 deployments there, was in country fairly recently with a government agency that cannot be named. He told me, Nasir, that from his perspective as an intelligence analyst, that one of the biggest mistakes Americans made was not understanding and being able to wrap their heads around the culture and the tribalism there, that Americans never really got it. What do we not get about Afghanistan? What do we not understand that would help?
I would like to go beyond Afghanistan and conclude and include the third world. The United States was enormously successful after World War II when it dealt with Eastern Europe, with the communist world, with Japan. These were all countries that had economic backgrounds similar to the United States, who had philosophical backgrounds similar to the United States, and the US knew how to treat them. And Germany was rebuilt, Japan was rebuilt, and Eastern Europe now is part of NATO. The United States never learned how to treat or understand the third world. The third world, most of the third world, have no industrial background. They're not developed economically. Most of them are religiously oriented. Secularism is not there. Especially in the Islamic world, the separation of politics, government, and religion is not there. It's a different world, and America has never tried to really understand it. I think the answer is that historically, the United States is a very young country. It exists for some 200 plus years.
Right.
And Afghanistan, for example, has been there for 3,000 years. And the third world, they have a long history. They have a totally different culture, and they are still formed and think in terms of their background. And I hope that we will, after this experience with Afghanistan, that we will actually try to learn how those people think, what they want, what they dislike, what they like, and then find a way to work with them, and slowly and gradually, perhaps to help them move in terms of time, move to today's world. That's the only way to do it.
So what you're saying is that perhaps an Afghanistan native and a West Virginia boy could sit in a room together and shake hands and learn from one another.
Always, yes.
Nasir Shansab is our guest. The
Thank you
book
very
is Silent Trees. It's a Power and Passion, War-Torn Afghanistan, from the publisher page imprint at Headline Books. I'll be thinking about your country, and I'll be praying for your people.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Wherever you're watching today, wherever you're listening, thank you so much for joining us today. For Kathy Tietz and the entire gang at Headline Books, and for our friends at SpeakerMatch.com, sponsors of the Big Time Talker podcast, I'm Burke Allen for Nasir Shansab, live in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Now go out there and make it a great day. Bye, everybody.